Hello, everyone. First and foremost, thanks so much to Jose, the organising committee, for the opportunity to be here today, and congratulations on such a great lineup so far. It's been fascinating. My name is Eimear Dolan. I am currently working in the University of São Paulo in Brazil. As you can probably tell, I'm not Brazilian, I'm Irish. And I'm going to talk today about energetic trade-offs within athletes with low energy availability. My talk is going to be quite maybe a change of pace in that I'm not going to present much any data, really. I'm not going to dive into anything very specific. I'm going to talk more on a kind of broader conceptual level. My background, I studied sport and exercise science. I work in exercise physiology and sports nutrition, and I've always had a huge interest in the kind of concept of energetic stress within elite athletes. My PhD focused on weight category athletes, horse racing jockeys. Even when life has kind of pulled me off in different directions, I've always had this interest kind of pulling me back. However, that's not really what I'm going to talk about today. A few years ago, when I moved to Brazil initially, it was to do a comparative physiology project. And that was just such an eye-opener for me. It was just a really different way of thinking, a different perspective, different approach. It was a real eye-opener for me. Shortly after that, through luck and chance, I kind of struck up first a friendship and then a collaboration with some evolutionary anthropologists. And we started working on some things together. And it, again, learning about a different kind of way of looking at perhaps the same problem, but from different approaches, for me was a really eye-opening experience. And my whole research program has kind of shifted now to kind of taking this perspective and slant. So what I want to do here today is to essentially talk through how this experience has been over the last couple of years, what I've learned, how I feel it applies within a sport and exercise science context. I will start with a disclaimer. I apologise, Lewis and any other kind of evolutionary trained anthropologists or biologists in the room. I am not an anthropologist. However, I do feel like this approach and perspective is something that we perhaps don't talk enough about in exercise science, and that we really, I just think it could be really beneficial, and it's also just cool and interesting. So basically that's what I'm going to talk through. So essentially, much of the work that I have been considering or that we're working on at the moment focus around concepts around midlife history theory. Now, this is a branch of evolutionary theory. It's a very broad and all-encompassing theory that has a lot of different applications, but essentially it looks at the diversity of strategies that have evolved to promote or optimize evolutionary fitness within particular environments. To the exercise people in the room, when I talk about evolutionary fitness, I'm not talking about fitness in terms of how quick you can run a mile. The evolutionary definition of fitness is your ability to pass your genetic material on within your given environment. And as we know, a huge range of strategies have evolved to allow for this. Now, one of the core kind of tenets or fundamental concepts of life history theory is the concept of trade-offs. And I know the text is very small in this, you don't need to read the text, but essentially my simplistic brain trying to bring this down, it looks at it from the point of view that energy is a finite resource. Energy that is used for one purpose cannot be used for others. So therefore, when you think about a body with internally competing systems and processes, there's going to sometimes be a trade-off among different tissues. Now, in the ideal scenario, thinking again from the kind of athlete point of view, you have a certain amount of energy coming in. You need to distribute it throughout the body. This is going to be distributed according, for example, to the metabolic rates of the different tissues, etc. And in the ideal scenario, enough is coming in that it can be used to simultaneously fuel everything and do everything, pay all the bills, etc., etc. However, in certain situations where either energy expenditure is elevated in one process and or reduced, for example, through caloric restriction, well, there's just less of it to be distributed around, and the body must allocate that in the way that makes most sense in that environment. So within an athletic context, when we think about athletes who do very high training-related energy expenditure, the proportion of the overall energy budget that's dedicated or that needs to be diverted towards training is much higher, which alone means there's less available in other areas. And I'll come on to that a little bit. So essentially the whole concept here is trade-offs. The body will try to protect the systems that are more immediately essential, and sometimes this might result in the suppression or the diversion of energy away from other systems. And this is likely to be, the nature of these trade-offs is largely going to depend on the extent of deficit, but it's also going to be very context specific. For example, things like life stage, age, sex, dietary composition, training status, health and injury status, the environment, whether it's hot, cold, altitude, all of these things can influence the nature of the trade-offs that are made. So that is, as I say, my very kind of simplistic, broad brushstroke sum up of how the core tenets of life history theory can be applied in this context. But bringing it to the athlete model, I think athletes represent such an interesting model to explore energetic stress or concepts related to energetic stress. If we consider physical activity guidelines for the general population is to get a minimum of 150 minutes per week, and large proportions of the population don't even make that. Well, an elite athlete can make that by breakfast. You've got certain groups of athletes, for example, particularly endurance-based athletes, that can train 5-6 hours a day, 5 to 6 days a week, easily enough notching up 30 hours of training per week, and always with that drive to kind of more, push the limits, push the boundaries. So when you're considering concepts related to energetic stress, in terms of the energy expenditure side of things, we're really pushing the limits there. But what makes it even more interesting, or at least some groups of athletes, is that coupled with this is that there are many, not all, but many athletes are trying to maintain as low a body mass as possible, and sometimes trying to consciously restrict their energy intake in order to make either a real or perceived weight requirement for sport. So any athlete can be subject to kind of low energy availability, and I'm not going to get into definitions between low energy availability and energy deficit. Carl has already told me he's going to cover the kind of the equations and the definitions more. But essentially, when I'm talking low energy availability, I'm talking about deficit, imbalance, less than the body needs. But there are certain sports, for example, aesthetic sports, where performance can be very much judged on viewing the lines of the body, where there's a real pressure sometimes on the athletes to maintain as low a body mass as possible. There's some weight category sports, such as most fighting sports, lightweight rowing, horse racing, etc., where the athletes actually have to adhere to a stipulated competition weight, and they're often going to try to strive to compete in the minimum weight possible because they perceive a competitive advantage. So there's real pressure there to maintain a low body mass. And many endurance sports, it's perceived to give a kind of a athletic performance advantage, particularly maybe some more aerodynamic style sports. So when you think about energetic stress from the point of view of expenditure and intake, we've got some group of athletes or a group of population here who are really pushing the boundaries on both sides in terms of both the expenditure and the intake side of things. Naturally, because this is such a group that is pushing these boundaries, we do have a lot of models within sport and exercise science to kind of study these concepts. For example, focusing more on the training side of things. We've got, for example, overtraining syndrome, the exercise hypogonadal male condition, focusing more on the energy side of things or the energy availability side. We've got the female and male athlete triads, the relative energy deficiency in sport syndrome. So we have various models that look at this from different aspects, but I would consider are all examining the same core concepts. Particularly relevant to today's discussions are two models called the female and male athlete triads, which I'll just put together for convenience sake today, and relative energy deficiency in sport. Now, these are essentially, there's much overlap between these in that they're fundamentally investigating what happens to the body when energy availability is low. The triad kind of focuses in on a trio of interrelated conditions, which is low energy availability with or without eating disorders, compromised bone mass or bone strength, sometimes culminating in osteoporosis, and functional hypothalamic amenorrhea or hypogonadism if we're talking about the male version. So the triad kind of is really focusing in on these, and there's quite a lot of evidence to indicate that these processes are impacted and interrelated when the body is in energy deficit. The relative energy deficiency in sport model, on the other hand, has similarities in that it's also looking at what happens when insufficient energy is available. However, it considers a far broader range of processes. It considers all the potential processes that could be affected. Now, I think it's kind of fair to say sometimes no model is right, but some are useful. And I think that it's really interesting that these kind of come from different angles. They approach the same problem, but perhaps from different angles, and both have their potentially own strengths and weaknesses. However, I feel like looking at this concept and within the context of these existing models, to consider some evolutionary perspectives, to try to think about why the body is allocating energy in the way it is, can be really useful in terms of developing hypotheses, pitching new questions, and maybe interpreting some of the data that we already have. Because as with any complex issue, what we know on this topic is really the tip of the iceberg compared to what we need to know. There's so many gaps in this research area in terms of how does low energy availability impact health performance, what levels does it affect, how do different factors impact that. So there's really a lot to be done here. And a couple of points that in these last couple of years that I've kind of learned or have occurred to me as I've been working with other disciplines and gaining some other perspectives I'm going to just kind of talk through a couple of them now. I'm not by any means going to solve anything or propose any new theories, just things that I think as a discipline, sport and exercise scientists, we might want to keep in mind while we're investigating these areas. And I think obviously for me the core one is this concept of constraints and trade-offs. Just returning to what I said there earlier, you have a certain amount of energy coming in, you've got a lot of bills to pay in terms of the fueling all of your body processes, and if there's less coming in as is being spent, that's going to cause trade-offs. One of, I think, the main criticism of the Red S model is that when you look at this diagram, it seems to imply that all systems are impacted simultaneously and independently, that you enter low energy availability and the body reacts. When you consider this from the point of view of trade-offs, it doesn't really make sense. The body is very smart. The body has a very high phenotypic plasticity where it's able to adapt to its environment, it's able to adapt to the circumstances, and it's going to work to try to restore balance and to keep functioning as best as possible throughout. So I think that is maybe a bit too oversimplistic, and obviously all models are a simplified version of a complex phenomena. But in reality, it probably looks a little more like this, with different systems being impacted, knocking off each other, affected at different rates, feeding in and out. And this is a zoomed in version. I think we can zoom that right the way back out to really get the full complexity of this. And I do think that that's something that we need to consider. I have purposely, by the way, don't try to read this, that's purposely, I Googled illegible words because I don't want to take responsibility for saying what order and when different systems are affected. But I think there's 2 points that for me kind of stand out here. Is one, I don't think it's particularly useful to kind of think dichotomously, is this system affected by low energy availability or energy deficit? Look, every cell, system, process depends on energy, so at some point, yes, everything is going to be affected. I think it's more useful to think in terms of a hierarchy of functional preservation. What does the body prioritize? What systems are more vulnerable to the extent of deficits typically faced by elite athletes, and how do different individual and environmental factors influence these things? Another thing that I think is very interesting to consider is that any time you make a change or try to manipulate something in a complex interconnected system, there's always the possibility of unintended consequences elsewhere. So for example, my own particular area of interest is, or my main research focus at the moment is around bone, exercise and nutrition. Now, there's quite a lot of evidence to indicate that athletes who seem to have low energy availability have compromised bone health. So we're thinking of strategies to potentially counteract that. For example, could higher impact exercise protect against it? Very possibly. But I also think if you're thinking in terms of trade-offs, if it doesn't happen here, could it be shifted elsewhere? What are the consequences of that? I don't have any answers, as I say, to these. I leave that to the people here can come up with the specific answers. But I think it's just something that we need to consider, because I feel like overall this area has perhaps come a little bit oversimplified, and I think it's not simple. It's complex, it's nuanced. No single study is going to fully ever address these things, but I just think it's useful to at least keep these things in mind. Another thing that I think is very interesting is to consider the possibility, does the body display a hormetic response to low energy availability? And I'm kind of using that interchangeably with energy deficit, but Carol is going to explain the equations and how things are calculated later. But essentially, when we talk about hormesis, we're talking about a biphasic dose-response relationship characterized by low-dose stimulation and high-dose inhibition. Again, I'm really doing this in the most simplistic way possible. But I think that is a very interesting thing, because I believe within my field, and obviously others can these are more discussion points, you can disagree with me. I feel like concepts around relative energy deficiency in sport, they become quite pathologized, as in every time we're eating less. It's become quite extreme sometimes. But I think there's worth considering that there is evidence to indicate, for example, that prolonged moderate caloric restriction throughout the lifestyle can actually prolong longevity and health of certain organs and certain tissues. There are elements of energy restriction or energy deficits that might actually be beneficial. And if you think about that from a kind of evolutionary perspective, exposure to stress is a key driver of evolutionary adaptation. So I think, and I'm not going to get into the mechanisms as to how this could happen because I have 20 minutes and I'm also not smart enough to be able to talk about them decisively. But I just think that that's something to consider. Professor Speakman, I'm a bit nervous about presenting your theory when you're here. I apologise in advance if I get it wrong. But one potential explanation around this. So we've got certain things off. Are we increasing the efficiency of certain processes? The clean cupboards hypothesis is just one that kind of resonated with me. And the example in the paper, which I highly recommend people read if they haven't already, is if you're locked in your house and somebody's delivering your food to you, but then they start reducing items and they stop giving you enough. You're going to go to the cupboards and you're going to start taking the excess. You're going to start organising things. You're going to start clearing out the junk. And I think that's a nice analogy for how certain levels of energy restriction might actually be beneficial if they encourage reduction of excess elsewhere. Now, that might not be the intended consequence. Evolutionary strategies are about promoting fitness, not longevity and health, but it might be happening. Again, I apologise if I got that very wrong. But I just think that that's something to keep in mind because I think within the kind of evolutionary literature, they often talk about kind of the money calorie kind of parallels. And we've all got a certain income, we've got a certain amount of bills to pay. There's a lot of situations where a bit of belt tightening is not a bad thing if it increases efficiency and encourages a more efficient use of resources. So I think that that is something to consider. So I think in terms of talking about returning to the point, I do tend to ramble off point a lot. When we're thinking about athletes, I think there's no doubt that prolonged exposure to low energy availability can have a detrimental outcome on many systems and processes. But I think it's much more useful to think about at what extent of deficit do detrimental outcomes occur. Something that's really interesting, I think, right now that we really need to consider is the differentiation between extent of deficit and exposure to it. So, for example, we could have certain groups of sports, or groups of athletes who are in a slow, steady, kind of a moderate restriction, but for very prolonged periods of time is quite habitual. On the other hand, we have groups of, say, for example, weight category athletes or jockeys or fighters who sometimes need to make weight and might pass through a brief phase of very extreme practices along the lines of what we were seeing earlier. Is there a difference in that? Is it the absolute deficit? Is it the length of it? Is it the extent of it? These are questions I think we need to, there's no easy answers, but I think we need to consider. I also think we need to be perhaps a little bit more critical in how we interpret response, because we have fascinating mechanistic studies, but sometimes they get right the way extrapolated along to kind of clinical or performance-related outcomes. And I think the differentiation between adaptive responses from deleterious clinical or performance outcomes, we need to be careful about that because our bodies are very smart. Sometimes they're obviously going to start out by considering trade-offs that are least detrimental. We wouldn't have survived as a species if we kind of immediately started shutting down essential processes. So I think that obviously the mechanistic work is so important, it's essential, it underpins so much. However, if we're going to make inferences about clinical or performance-related outcomes, we need actual measures that measure these things. So I think sometimes we put the cart before the horse a little bit in that area. So these are just kind of, I was coming to take-home points or ending my presentation and I realised I don't really have any. This is just a general kind of discussion of some ideas that emerged while I was in conversation with some of these people I was working with. I think I don't know how to pronounce his name, Theodosius Dobzhansky. It's such an oft-used quote, but the fact that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. I think it is it's true, it makes sense. And I think from the sport and exercise science point of view, I think we're very focused sometimes on what happens and how the body responds to different stressors, such as energetic stress. And that's essential and that's brilliant, but sometimes it can be very useful to just take a step back and think why? Why? Do these results really make sense in terms of a broader context? And that, for me, has been where learning or attempting to learn about things like life history theory and various other processes, it's just kind of given an umbrella framework to situate ideas within, to try to interpret. Like I said, there's no easy answers here to any of these, but I just feel like taking a step back and kind of looking at the bigger picture, not always, but sometimes, is kind of a useful thing to do. I also think that athletes, as I mentioned before, provide a really interesting model to investigate some of these aspects, because they're habitually doing things that the general population don't do. They're pushing the boundaries on both sides in terms of striving to do more, while often trying to minimize one side and maximize the other. So there's some really useful natural experiments to be considered here and to be looked at. That was obviously just a very broad brushstroke talk. However, myself and groups of colleagues have tried to describe these ideas with a little bit, hopefully a little bit more depth and structure in these papers. And I think for me, one of the big benefits of engaging with this kind of work has been the people I've met, the conversations we've had. It's just so interesting to talk to people who approach things from a different way or have different areas, and kind of really opened up way of thinking and new opportunities that I hope will continue. And no idea how I am in time, but that's basically it. Just ideas, love to continue chatting, and thank you very much.